Hi, this is Misha, and I thought we'd revisit the AR-15 a bit. We've been very AK heavy lately, and that's really my primary field of interest. And as always, I really say for a good bit of info on the M16A15, visit Chris's channel. But I thought I'd just bring my guns out. We had the SP1 out for a different video already. Then we just kind of look at the evolution of the AR-15 rifle. Here we have my SP1, which is a semi-automatic version of the original Colt XM16 or model 602. Then we have a build I did on a Nodak A1 lower using one of the surplus National Guard M16A1 uppers. This is a semi-automatic version of a Colt 603. Then we have a Colt M16A2 upper built on a generic, I think it's a Century or whatever, just A2 lower, whatever I had laying around that day. And this is a semi-clone of, say, a Colt 605, or you could say, 705 or 701, I guess it doesn't really matter. It's semi. And finally, we have a factory Colt built AR15A4, which is a semi-automatic version of a 901 or 905. And this is the evolution beginning in 1960 and rolling through really just currently. The A4s are just now starting to go kind of out of service in favor of carbines. So this is the general broad strokes of the evolution. So how did we get from that to this to that? Well, it's a long history, and if I try to tell it all here, we'll have a 2-hour video. But after World War II, there were many studies done looking at essentially accurate aimed fire, mass infantry fire, self-loading fire, bolt action fire, and automatic fire. They really concluded that having a gun capable of automatic fire increased an army, a unit's lethality. It did not decrease it. It was sometimes thought that, oh, if we give them full auto fire, they'll just spray and pray and never take accurate shots. They decided this isn't really true, at least not in many cases. After Korea in 1953, the company of Armalite was founded, and it was a division of Fairchild. Now Fairchild was an aerospace contractor, and Armalite was a firearms division essentially tasked with creating brand new designs using modern materials and techniques. One of the first big names to join Armalite was Melvin Johnson, who designed the Johnson 1941 light machine gun and rifle. He's important because he's the one that really gave us the multi-lug rotating bolt in the AR-15. Shortly after he joined, everyone's famous arms designer of the 20th century, Eugene Stoner, joined. And he really added to it, worked on the gas system, and came up with the AR-10, chambered for the then new 7.62 NATO. Unfortunately, the AR-10 was radically new, radically different, and was also a little late to the party. Even though it was tested against the T-44 and the T-48, it was really already a foregone conclusion that the T-44 would be adopted, and it became the M14 in 1957. Now we'll do another video looking at the M14 versus the AR-10 and AR-15, but that was the first attempt, and there were several reasons it wasn't accepted. Armalite quickly turned to Remington and partnered with them to develop a new cartridge based on 222, which was a sporting cartridge, and came up with 223 Remington. To fire it, they scaled down the AR-10 and came up with the AR-15. Early tests were very positive. However, this thing had been in development for years. Fairchild was losing patience with Armalite, and therefore Armalite was more or less forced to sell the AR-15 platform to Colt, which it purchased in December of '59. And by 1960, Colt was producing this 601 or the Colt model 01 AR15, which was very similar to this gun here. It was the original AR15 in select fire. The 01 had a 1 in 14 twist rate, so the bullets loved to tumble when they hit targets. Had a 20-inch pencil profile, lightweight barrel, a 6.25 diameter. It had a lot of early features. And if we talk about every feature, guys, again, we'll be here hours. But, you know, early on, for example, the stocks were brown, then they would paint them for a while before settling on the black look we know today. The Air Force was early interested in the AR-15. Malaysia was an early purchaser of the full auto AR-15 as well. And Project Agile was an early field test combat use of the Colt 601, and the results were very encouraging. To that end, General McNamara, I screwed that up, sorry guys. To that end, the Air Force originally ordered 80,000 to replace aging M1 carbines. However, McNamara basically convinced Kennedy to axe it, to not let it go through, you know, Commander-in-Chief and all that. So there was a big back and forth, 61, 62, about the AR-15, lots of politics, so on and so forth. But in 1963, further M14 orders were canceled, and the last M14s would be built and delivered to the military by 65. And so the AR-15's future was looking brighter. Also in 1963, Colt introduced the Model 602. The major difference was a faster 1 in 12 twist rate. This was done to let bullets be a little more stable, especially in Arctic environments. This addressed one of the major concerns that the military was having about the original 601. This would be type classified as the XM16 by the Air Force, and again, orders would be placed. Now, there were many changes early on, not just the 1 in 14 barrel twist. 1964 was one of the biggest years for these. Now, we have an SP1 video on just this gun where I really look at a lot of the features and take it apart, so check that out for some. But for example, early on, the front sight base was cast. They would go to a forging. They would improve the original 3-prong so-called duckbill flash hider to come up with this one. It has stronger prongs on it. One of the earliest changes Colt actually did, the original Armalite AR15 had a cocking handle shaped much like a trigger in this carry handle. They would go to the more traditional one we know today, although the earliest ones were a triangle shape. But this would quickly be changed to this pattern here, the modern style we know. Likewise, the dust cover of the port door would be modified. This is a early A1 style. The early 601 used a slightly different port door. You probably can't even tell on camera. Likewise, the mag catch changed the way it was machined a bit. Early guns would have what was called a skinny pistol grip. This one does. Then they would slightly widen it up. The earliest guns would be fitted with so-called waffle mags, and we would go to the more modern style we know with just the vertical ribbing. This is still an early modern style with the kind of left in the white. They originally were just heat treating these. They weren't always anodizing them. The early components, push pins, would have holes in them like this safety does here. And the early guns, the 601 and the 602s, would have a very similar front pin. Now this is of course a semi-auto, so we have this, but the first ones did have a pin that was retained using a notch in the upper and the lower, and they did not have the top vents here as it's known today because they didn't have a captive front pin. It was removable at that time. As I said, the furniture would kind of go to the common black that we know today. And so those are all changes done in 63, 64. In 64, a new version, the Colt 603, was introduced. And this was done to try to satisfy the U.S. Army. The U.S. Air Force was pretty happy with the Colt 602, frankly. But the Army had some changes it wanted. Now this is a later production kit, but it has the forward assist to show you. This was the major addition for the 603. This was something done at the request, the insistence even, of the U.S. Army. Both Eugene Stoner and Colt said, no, we don't want this, but they did. There's a lot on the early reliability. I'll touch on it briefly. I don't want to open up that hornet's nest, but yeah. The Army would designate this the XM16E1 for experimental model. And they would start to ship them to soldiers in Vietnam in 1965. As the reports would come back, they would make modifications, and Colt was continually tinkering with this design. For one, the all-chromed bolt group would eventually be replaced by a mixture of phosphating, parkerizing, and chroming, and then eventually all parkerized by the end of 65. Colt actually wanted to go to a parkerized carrier earlier, but the military took time before they would approve this. Another early part that was quickly done away with was the Edgewater buffer. It was a solid, lightweight buffer, and it led to much too fast cyclic rate. So they went to the buffer we know today that has weights inside. Actually, an early version of it was a little different, but very, very similar. Now, this was all the kind of reply to accusations of these guns not being reliable, jamming in the field, and they did sometimes, although really not at the levels that some make it out to be today. Part of it wasn't Colt that marketed this as a self-cleaning gun. That was more a military thing. So that was one problem. They told soldiers you don't have to clean it. Another, they did not have chrome-lined barrels this early on. Now, I know that sounds strange because World War II we had a lot of guns with chrome-lined barrels, but keep in mind these were .30 caliber and up. In the 1960s, they still weren't comfortable with mass-producing chrome-lined barrels for such a small .22 caliber bore. So that's the reason they didn't do it. One thing they did start doing in 1964 was magnetic particle testing the barrels to ensure there weren't any hidden flaws or failure points. So they started issuing cleaning kits with these, and there was a big hullabaloo about the powder. They were using, the military switched the powder on the cartridges. We know about this, and there's a big thing. Again, I refer you to Chris. He has an entire video basically on the powder switch up. Basically, they'll take away this. Colt had a pretty good gun, and the military kept monkeying with it, trying to make it something it wasn't, not really fully understanding it, and even to some extent intentionally trying to sabotage it. There were still many traditionalists that wanted the M14 to still succeed and wanted the AR15 XM16 to fail. And also, in the gun's defense, every other U.S. service gun had years of testing stateside before it was put in the field. The AR-15 was dropped immediately into the field as early as 1961. And as they would make changes and updates, they would just immediately ship them over to Vietnam. So it's a little unfair to judge it along the same lines as, say, the Garand. Keep in mind, the Garand, work began on it in the 20s. It was officially adopted in 36. However, there were many changes made up until 1940, most importantly the gas system. So the Garand had those years to grow and be perfected, whereas the M16 did not. If the Grand, if World War II had begun earlier, had been thrown into the field in 1936-37, Lord knows what the result would have been. Probably nothing good, because those early gas trap systems were a nightmare. So I'm just, in defense of the AR-15. Now, as I said, I'm mostly an AK guy, so this is me, an AK guy, defending the AR-15's performance in Vietnam. Well, as time would go on, the XM16E1 would receive several changes, 66 and 67 mostly. For one thing, we would start to add a drain hole to the buttstock screw to keep water from getting trapped in the buffer tube, because if you get water in here, the hydraulic back pressure can really goof things up. We also stopped roll pinning the tube, the receiver extension, to the lower receiver. We went to the more modern style of tube as well, with the wrench flats on the end. Much better design. We would widen up the pistol grip a bit. All the little holes and things and the pins and the safety would disappear. That was really just an early artifact from manufacturing that was never really there for any reason. We would go to a full fence lower. The XM16E1 would introduce the captive front pin, which would give us the top fence. And then a short time later, they would introduce the full fence by 1967 to guard against the mag release being accidentally hit. Now this is like I said, this is a National Guard upper. It has an A2 port door, but they did modify the A1 port door a bit from 1964 through 66. There's some small manufacturing changes there as well. Still have the forward assist. They, for whatever reason, really liked it. One important change they would make, they would go from a carbon steel to a stainless steel gas tube, and they would change the geometry and the angle bend of the tube. This made sure it would not foul up, corrode up as quickly, and also would more reliably cycle the gun. So they would change the bolt group further. They would go to the more squared off style of gas key. They would also replace the early machined retaining pin with the cotter pin we know today, and the firing pin would be improved. Early we would have the fat head, and then we would have the improved flat head, and then we would have the modern style. This was all done to prevent slam fires. Remember, the AR does not have a spring-loaded firing pin, so they didn't want the firing pin to have so much inertia that it could accidentally set off rounds. There are many other little changes as time would go on. Of course, the A1 bird cage. This was one of the later additions to the XM16E1 in 1967. It was put on right before the adoption and type classification. Another change was they started to go to a chrome-lined chamber. Not bore yet, but just chamber. We also added a drain hole to the front sight base under the front sight itself. And we added drain holes, as they're called. They're not really drain holes, but we added those to the handguard. And all of these changes would come together to be type classified as the M16A1 in 1967. And it would get into full adoption at this point by the Army. It would be the Colt Model 603, they kept that name. The Air Force, it would go from XM16 to just M16, and they would be purchasing the Colt Model 604. It was identical, except it did not have the forward assist. However, its bolt would have the serrations for it, because Colt was using the same bolt carrier for forward assist or not. And these would go into full production in Vietnam. Joining Colt at manufacturing would be Harrington and Richardson, HRA, and Hydromatic, GM Hydromatic. So now we have three manufacturers. Those guys started off in 1968. And this is when you start to see Colt putting C's on a lot of the parts. They started adding C to the barrel proofs and other things because now we have multiple manufacturers, so they needed to mark their parts. And of course, H&R and Hydromatic GM mark theirs as well. Just as a side note, the early contract guns had some issues getting started, but they eventually got them ironed out. By 1970, we see some of the last changes to the design. We start to introduce the A1 buttstock, as it's called, even though the A1 was adopted still with the original solid body stock. This has a trap door to store your cleaning kit in, a metal butt plate versus rubber. Also, we've gone away from the rotating sling swivel to a fixed. We've also started riveting the front sling swivel as opposed to using a roll pin. And they would stop machining the flashing off here on the front and on the back, and just leave it in the raw that we know today. They would also go to a fully chromed bore. Originally, these would be marked CMP-C for chrome chamber, then CMP-CB for chrome chamber and bore, and then in the mid-70s, I think it was around 74, Colt would simply go to CMP chrome bore. A little more distinctive. We're still using the 1 in 12 twist, still using the stainless steel gas tube. This is later pattern furniture. It has more of a matte finish, less shiny than the early stuff. And while the 21 mag was still technically standard, 30 rounds really started to appear in heavy numbers by 69, 70 in Vietnam. And of course, these 20 rounds would be fully finished out. They wouldn't be left in the white, in the gold colors on the early mags. So that was pretty much where the M16 left off. We're firing a 55 grain projectile out of a 1 in 12 twist barrel, as I said. These are both, originally these were both full auto capable. They had a selector for safe, semi, and full. And this would be standard issue in the U.S. military throughout the 70s and into the 80s. In 1977, NATO members, mostly Europeans, wanted to standardize, and so tests were done on various cartridges. What was ultimately selected was a 62 grain projectile designed in Belgium, and this is the cartridge we basically know today. And NATO wanted to standardize around it. Now this new heavier weight bullet needed a 1 in 7 twist, needed a faster twist than the 1 in 12. This ultimately led to the U.S. military needing a new pattern of gun. And that's where this is from here. Let me see if I can rearrange, guys, a little bit. Well, while they had to adopt a new gun with a faster twist rate, they took the opportunity to introduce quite a few changes. I'm not going to say improvements, some are, some aren't, I think. This is the M16A2. It was officially adopted in 1982, however, it really didn't enter into service until around 1986. There wasn't an immediate need, there wasn't a war like Vietnam going on. Money was a little tight, and the rest of NATO wasn't exactly in a hurry to adopt either. Most of if you look at the other NATO members, they were all putting forth guns or even adopting guns in the new caliber. This is, now becoming known as 5.56 versus 223 because we're going international. It's worth noting that the original 5.56 designation started to appear in the late 60s, but that became the more common name than 223 in the 80s. So there wasn't a huge rush. So it took a few years for these to actually go into production and get issued. They would start to be fielded in the late 80s, but even by the first Gulf War in 91, there were still quite a few units, especially National Guard types, that still had the older M16A1, which is, again, where my other upper came from. Anyway, the changes we have here. We have a new pattern of flash hider. The original M16A1 birdcage has 6 ports and is a flash hider only. The M16A2 has 5 ports and they're on the sides and top. The bottom is solid, as most of you probably are familiar with, and this was done to try to make it act also as a bit of a muzzle brake, a recoil check. We still have a 20-inch barrel, but now we have a medium heavy profile. Under the handguards here, we still have the skinny profile of the A1, but out here at the gas block, we flare out to a heavy profile. The front sight shape was changed some to a square post. The base, of course, was modified for the heavier barrel. We still use a triangle-shaped handguard retainer in the front, but we've gone to these new round pattern of handguards. These are not only more durable than the A1 handguards, but with the A1 you had left and right. With these, you have top and a bottom half, but they're interchangeable. They're not marked top and bottom. So logistically, it's much nicer. We've gone to from the flat slip ring on the early rifles to the delta ring we know today. Now this was actually first tried out on the XM17A1 carbines and Guile carbines and was carried over to the rifle. This was done to make handguard removal much easier, and it does. We've gone to the A2 style port door with more of a flare here. This is so when it's down, it's easier to grab and get back up. The upper, we still have a forward assist. This is a standard round one. The early ones were also round, but a little bigger, so we've gone away from the teardrop shaped forward assist. The carry handle is still here. It's still fixed on the A2, but we've gone to this much more fancy pants rear sight. The original A1 had just a flip aperture and then a wheel that you could use a bullet tip or a tool to rotate for windage. This is now adjustable with your hand for windage. Also now we have a new elevation knob, and we still have a flip aperture rear sight. One aperture is too small, one is too big, as most have told me in the military, especially Marines. The A2 lower at first looks very similar to the A1. We still have a full fence, but they've beefed it up at the front pivot pin. There's more material down here. Also, we've beefed it up at the back where the extension meets it. It's thicker here. We've made it stronger. The bolt group is essentially the same. No real change there. The buffer was only slightly updated. The buttstock was made longer, just over half an inch longer. I think it's 5/8 of an inch longer. We've gone to a slightly different pattern of a butt plate. Still holds a cleaning kit in here. It's made out of a more modern material as well. Thick sling swivel down here. The A2 pistol grip was introduced. Most everyone knows. We've added this thumb rest, and we got rid of that hole in the bottom of the A1 grip, which was originally intended for a sling swivel, but was never really used as such. If you are interested in what I'm talking about, look at the Armalite AR15 AR180. Its sling swivel is here. But that hole was there from the A1. They got rid of it because it was never used or necessary for the A2 grip. The biggest change for the lower stuff They added this tick mark to the safety here. And if this were a real Colt lower, we would also have markings on the right side for safe, semi, and full. Of course, this is just a cheap semi-auto lower, so yeah. But normally they would add selector markings and a tick here so you could see. Also, the selector is reversible. You could put it on the right side. Another thing they did to make these a little more lefty friendly, they added the brass deflector. So there were some attempts to make these guns partially ambidextrous. So one other major change that I can't show you here was the fire mode. The A2 made 3-round burst standard instead of automatic, full automatic. This was the Colt 705 model. Now Colt would make a version of this gun that retained full auto, and it would have even be adopted as the M16A3. And many consider having full auto a superior trait versus 3-round burst. There's a lot of back and forth. They did also make the 30-round mag standard with these guns. Again, they were in service long before the A2s, but they became officially standard with them. And as I said, some of these changes are good, some not so good. This rear sight's more finely adjustable, sure, but I don't know of many people in combat that ever take that time. And it's on a moving base, so it's not as durable as the older A1 sight. It's a little too fidgety, I think, for most people. I do think this new pattern of handguard is better, more durable, and the fact that the top halves and the bottom halves are interchangeable is nice. The longer stock isn't, for me personally, it doesn't bug me, but I'm short enough that I didn't mind the A1 stock. And if you're wearing heavy clothing or gear, it might be in the way. The heavier barrel definitely adds weight, and that's the main thing. The original idea with the M16 was a lightweight, handy gun. And when you go to the A2, you're really kind of getting away from that. You're adding a considerable amount of weight to this for not a lot of gain. The idea was to increase the gun's accuracy. And I'm not sure they were that successful. A lot of these changes were pushed forward by the U.S. Marines, by the way, who still had the every man as a marksman notion. But either way, those are the changes for the A2. As I said, these started to enter service and went into the field first in Europe and then elsewhere in the 80s. By the 90s, pretty much all the other older A1s were either out of service or sent over to National Guard reserves. And so this became the new de facto standard for the U.S. military at the time when the Cold War was ending. The M16A2 was really just getting into service in large numbers when its replacement was adopted. Now, it would not be another rifle, it was the M4 carbine, first selected in 1995. Of course, it takes several years to get these in the field, and many units did not receive them till around the turn of the millennium. But most in the Army, Air Force, even Navy would go to a carbine model if they had not already been using it. It really made sense by modern warfare and what was going on with the type of fighting at the time. And of course the M4 saw extensive use in the early days of Afghanistan and the Iraq War Part 2. But one holdout, again, as with the A2, pushing it forward, was the U.S. Marine Corps. They still had that every man a rifleman, every man a marksman attitude, so they hung on to their A2s. But even they had to admit they were aging. They had the fixed carry handle was the main thing, and so on and so forth. This led to the Colt M16A4. And this is a clone of it here to some extent. Of course, this is the semi-automatic version. This is very much like the A2 except it has a few of the updates first really introduced by the M4 or other Colt models. The biggest is we have a removable carry handle. Originally these would be used with a carry handle, but it had a Picatinny rail underneath. And soon that would be pulled off in most guns and an optic put on. I've got a fake ACOG on this one with a backup MOTAC iron sight, which is at least reasonably representative of what would have been used on these. The buttstock is the same from the A2. Receivers are the same. Some would have an ambidextrous selector. This one does have the markings on the right side, as it should. Some would all have other ambidextrous lower parts added over time to try to keep them modern. Bolt group's the same, buffer group's the same. Several different handguard units were used, but this is the one by Knight's Armament, which is most common. It's a pretty lightweight two-piece rail system. It does not require removing the barrel. It comes with these rail covers, which many people in the military consider removable handguard sections. And as gear is needed, they would take them off and put them on. This one just has the Knight's foregrip and a Harris bipod. Very simple. You will also find laser designators very commonly put on these. And whatever the mission calls for, you know, the railed system really made the M16A4 flexible. The barrel is the same as the A2, 1-in-7 twist, 20-inch, heavy out here, skinny under the handguard. Takes a standard bayonet. That's about it. It is worth noting that some of the late rifle versions would have the heavy profile barrel under the handguard as well, sort of like a Colt M16A1. These would be designated in the Colt 901, 905 series, in that range, for the updated M16A2 essentially. And this looks to be the last standard issue rifle, AR-15 rifle in the U.S. military. Even the U.S. Marine Corps has recently started to transition away from the A4 and using the M4 and other guns. Really, the accuracy gains with the 20-inch barrel over 14 are not enough to warrant the longer length and the additional weight, as much as some might want to think. That said, I really like the A4 as just a shooter, and I consider the Colt AR15A4 to be the spiritual successor to the Colt SP1 semi-auto. So I think it's really neat that Colt has put out another full-length rifle semi-auto for us. That was kind of a brief rundown of the history of the AR-15 rifle. We will have a video on the carbine history as well, so check that out for more on, you know, the XMs and the M4s. And I fully admit I'm not an expert on these things. I just find the history, and I like the older so-called retro guns a great deal. So if you have any comments, please post them below. I welcome any constructive criticism, but just know that I'm not pretending to know all the things, especially about the more modern guns, because my interest is in history. If you like the video, please click like. If you have not already subscribed and would like to do so, we'd greatly appreciate that too. As always, this is Misha. And please tune in again next time for more, hopefully, interesting videos. We'll catch you then.